What's the biggest slip up you ever made that was fixed before anyone knew about it? My mom is a very soft spoken, gentle woman. Only heard her curse maybe once in my life. Very old fashioned, super kind, so innocent, she's amazing. As a teenager, I was a rebellious little kid and was always up to no good. I had a best friend whose parents were super religious. We met at a Christian private school and we would get into mischief with each other. One time, we were out around 2 a.m. and went to another friend's house whom we hadn't talked to in years that went to the Christian school with us. We knocked on his window and asked him to sneak out, but he said he couldn't. He then, in turn, apparently told his parents about it, and his parents contacted my friend's parents. If we got into any more trouble together, we weren't going to be allowed to hang out anymore. So one night, my friend and I rode one bicycle about 10 miles to go to this girl's house, taking turns sitting on the handlebars. We had a reason for wanting to go, but we didn't stay long, so after our long, arduous journey, we set out on our return trip. And not 5 minutes after embarking, a cop pulls up and stops us. It's around 4 or 5 in the morning, and I hadn't even thought about curfew being a thing. He called up both our parents, and my mom came to pick us up. He was unable to reach my friend's parents, so he left a message on the machine. Knowing this was the inevitable, forced termination of our friendship, I convinced my mother to drive to his house on a covert mission. He lived out in the boonies, so when we arrived at his house, she had to turn off her lights and drive stealthily down this country road of a driveway. He snuck inside while his parents slept, deleted the message off the machine, and we escaped scot-free. To this day, I still can't believe my mother did that for us. Super OG stuff, totally uncharacteristic of her. My friend and I are still in contact decades later, even though he lives in Thailand now. Thanks, Mom. Okay, so this dude's mom was the real OG, for real. Story 2. When I was in high school, my friends had a VW Golf and a station wagon. I had keys to both of the cars, although I normally drive the Golf because it was a GTI and a hoot to drive. A local mall had the movie theater, arcade, and food court all near one particular entrance, which was normally my preferred place to park. One Saturday, I didn't have much going on, so I got up, drove the station wagon to the mall, played some games, went around for a bit, hung out with some friends, then got in my car and went home. When I got home, both my parents were gone, which was weird, but I thought, it's cool, I can just watch what I want to on TV. So I grabbed a bag of chips and started watching some movie on HBO. About an hour or so into the movie, I realized, hey, wait a minute, I didn't drive the Golf to the mall, but I drove the Golf home. Oh, crap. I realized my parents had driven to the mall in the Golf and used the same exact parking area I used. When I got out of the mall, I must have seen the Golf, just got in it, and absent-mindedly drove home. My parents were still at the mall, had been for over an hour, which was a record for my dad, and I was certain my father was in the midst of calling the cops to report a stolen car. I jumped into the Golf, drove as quickly as I could back to the mall, and had my mother seen the way I drove, she would have probably killed me. By some miracle, the exact spot my parents had parked in was available, so I just parked the car there. I then walked a couple of rows over and got into the station wagon and drove home. My parents came home like 30 minutes later. I asked them how the mall was, and my father started complaining about how my mother made him shop for a new bedroom set or whatever. But other than that, it was fine. I didn't tell him that story until I was in my late 20s. Story 3. As an undergrad in college, I worked in a research lab for the school's chemical engineering department. My partner and I were making a reactor that could contain hydrogen gas, and hydrogen gas is the smallest molecule there is, which makes it very difficult to effectively contain. We made our prototype reactor and needed to test it out to make sure it was sealed tight and could handle high internal pressure. To do this, we submerged it in a 55-gallon barrel of water and kept pumping air into it to see if any bubbles escaped. We kept filling it with air and didn't see any bubbles and wanted to know at what pressure it started to leak, so we just kept pumping air in. It didn't leak. It exploded. Fortunately, the explosion was contained by the water. But all that air being rapidly released blew all the water out of the barrel and flooded our professor's lab. There was no drain in the floor in case of a chemical spill, and you didn't want that hitting the public water supply. So we had to break into the janitor's closet and get the entire lab cleaned up. To this day, our professor still doesn't know about it, and it wasn't even the only time we accidentally blew something up or flooded his lab. And our project wasn't to design the reactor was just one component of the larger project. Another, in particular, submitted coursework for Module B on the due date of Module A. Would have been an auto-fail, however, the system derped out and the teacher didn't receive any work from about half the class and asked us to email her a copy. I sent her the work for Module A, only realizing I would have failed outright once I saw what I'd done. Everyone in the class complained about delayed grades and how they should file a complaint while I'm just sitting there thanking whatever divinity watched over that transaction. Story 4. I very nearly injected a premature baby that had Down syndrome with 10 times the amount of Lasix I was supposed to give him. I had put the decimal in the wrong place when I did the math on the dose. That baby would almost certainly have passed if I'd given it to him. I had the liquid drawn up in the syringe and had the syringe actually in the port ready to push through before I looked inside the chamber and realized how uncharacteristically full it seemed. Pediatric 4 doses of anything are simply tiny. I was supposed to give him 0.1 milliliters and I nearly gave him 1.0 milliliters. I needed a very large cup of tea after that. So people are asking how this happened and why no one double-checked the dose. That afternoon, there was a couple who had a history of combative behavior and who had also assaulted a doctor 4 cots down who had come in to see their medicated withdrawing baby. They were yelling at the nurse who was taking care of their baby, and the woman who was with me said to me, "You're right with this, aren't you, Janie?" and hightailed it off to make sure that the nurse was safe and to try and de-escalate the situation. The yelling and disruptive environment, and also because I was distracted by that, is most likely why I had made the mathematical error in the first place. I did end up telling someone what happened after I had calmed down, and one of the upshots of this was that that particular couple was given a behavioral order for the special care nursery. Also, double-checking is in no way a failsafe, though of course it can and does help. Thing is, 2 people will see exactly the wrong thing and both think it's the right thing. A few years after this incident, I was a victim of a drug error myself when I was in hospital and I was given 20 times the intended dose of morphine. 2 nurses had looked at the order, drawn it up, came to my bedside, checked my ID tag, checked the dose again, and then gave it to me. Drug mistakes are an unfortunate reality of being in a hospital, and people will always somehow get around the rules and checks and balances and manage to make them. Story 5. I failed one of my classes in college, which was going to prevent me from taking a class during the next semester since it was a prerequisite. The class I failed wasn't available to take again until the following year, which would have pushed my graduation back an entire year. On top of all of that, I'm in a program for quote-unquote older, I'm not that old, but not fresh out of high school either, students going back to school that pays for my tuition and all school fees. I had no idea what would have happened with that if I needed to stay a whole extra year just for one class. I probably would have had to pay for it myself, which I wouldn't have been able to afford anyway. I went to the academic advisor who looked at my other marks and was surprised I failed that class because all my other marks were good. I really have no excuse, I just wasn't paying attention to that class as much as the others and hadn't handed in half of the assignments, and didn't do well on any of the tests either. She told me to go talk to the professor of that class to see if there was anything he could do, since it was strange that all my other marks were so good, but I completely bombed that one class. So I went to the professor, who basically said that he would have to talk to the associate dean of our department because even though that semester was over, there was still a week or so before he had to have all the marks from that semester in, but he needed permission to let me hand things in so late, and I was also going to have to retake the final exam. And in the meantime, I better start working on finishing and handing in as many of the missed assignments as I could. And I'm so grateful to that professor for letting me do that because I got permission from the dean. They even overrode the system to add the class I needed the prerequisite for to my schedule, while I worked on handing in the missed assignments and retaking the final exam for the failed class. In the end, I passed the class, my mark was changed, and I was back on track. I didn't even miss any of the class they had to override the schedule for because it was the same professor as the class I failed, and he told me to come to the class even if it wasn't in my schedule yet. That all happened within a week. I only told one close friend. I didn't want to tell my parents because I already dropped out of university a few years before and didn't need them feeling disappointed in me again. And I also never informed the program that I'm in either. So I'm still on track to graduate and I'm still getting my schooling paid for. It was a very stressful week, but like I said, it was completely my fault for just somehow overlooking that one class. I made sure not to make that same mistake again. You owe that professor a dinner or something, because that was very cool of them to help you out like that. Real life redo. Another thing that would be super cool is if you would hit that like button and subscribe to my channel because it really helps me out. Thank you. Now let's go ahead and get back to these stories. Story 6. When I was 15, I tried to bake a carrot cake and I think I misread how much carrots to put and ended up with maybe 10 times the amount of carrots you're supposed to make. Whatever I did, it became the mushiest cake ever. Guests were already coming, and in a stroke of genius, I told my mom's friends, since 2 of you are bringing your babies along, I made it extra soft for them. I also reduced the sugar and increased the carrots to make it healthier. My parents' friends kept going on about what a thoughtful, sweet kid I am, baking a cake specially with babies in mind. The weird thing was the babies were hooked on the cake. One of the moms kept calling my mom for the next few months asking if I had time to bake that cake again. I did try to replicate it, but I just couldn't, so I kept pretending I was too busy. I met her kid again when she was 11, and apparently one of her earliest memories was eating that cake. Her mom told me I was the one who baked it for her, so she was really excited to meet me because, in her memories, it's some kind of mind-blowing awesome cake that no cake has ever compared to. I had to burst her bubble and tell her what really happened. I would have just kept quiet and basked in glory forever. Story 7. Parents went out for the weekend. I wasn't a bad kid, so there was only one rule: no hookah in the living room. Easy enough, smile and wave, promise not to burn the house down, yada yada yada. I end up smoking hookah in my living room, which had been recently recarpeted. One of my friends goes to flip the coal, and I gave him a warning of how this was the only rule I had, and if he dropped the coal, my parents would never let me live it down. Plus, I didn't have enough money to get my entire living room recarpeted before they got back. He nods and goes for the coal. Next thing I know, the red-hot coal falls onto the carpet and starts sizzling a nice burn hole directly into the center of the rug. I jump for it, attempting to pick up the hot coal with my hands. I succeed in getting the coal back into the hookah, but not before shooting a bunch of embers onto a floor mat by the door. The floor mat was a surplus section left over from the new rug and luckily had the same wear and weave pattern as the area I had burned. Luckily again, one of the friends I was with had a father who installed rugs professionally. So on Sunday, George, who we now call the Carpet Whisperer, worked overtime on his hands and knees to patch the spot I had burned. A half hour before my parents got home, George finishes up and left me the burnt cutout piece, promising not to tell my parents. He did leave me with the burnt section he cut out, which I still have tucked away for a special day. Story 8. As a younger teen, I nearly burned my house down. My young life was saved by a 5-gallon bucket of paint and a hardware store clerk. I was 13 and one summer day I was left to my own devices. This is particularly dangerous to me as at the time I didn't have the internet to occupy me. So, doing what any teen boy would do, I started playing with fire. I started by using things like magnifying glasses, a parabolic mirror, and eventually moved up to WD-40 and a lighter. Now my childhood home was in a small town and was an older home that had a fireplace, so we often had a pile of wood near the garage which commonly attracted these giant black ants. Now, me being the evil genius, I decided to get rid of these ants that were crawling up the garage door frame. So I took the redneck flamethrower I had made, I played Fortunate Son by CCR and began to have flashbacks to Nam. Only I forgot to take the little straw out of the sprayer nozzle before unleashing the smog like fury and destruction, and this promptly blew out my tiny flame. So as I felt humiliated and quickly restarted the song in my blazing fury, quickly scorching the ants, now here is where the story gets fun. In my hurry to destroy things, I didn't notice how much WD-40 had soaked into the painted wooden door frame where I had been spraying out my lighter moments earlier. So as I finished my destruction of ants and became a less vengeful ant god, I quickly noticed there was still fire creeping up the painted piece of wood. The fire really started to grow and take over as my young mind frantically searched for the water hose to save my house. As the fire subsided, I realized there was now a very obvious paintless burnt spot which I would soon have to answer for. I quickly scrubbed away the smoke residue and began to formulate a plan. After seeing the wood wasn't really damaged past the paint, I had an epiphany. Why not just repaint this area? So I scampered after my allowance and took a chunk of paint to match, grabbed my trusty hog, my bicycle, and headed off to the hardware store to hopefully save myself from eternal groundation. Now in a small town like mine, a lot of people knew each other and their kids were often known as well, which posed a problem for me as my grandfather was pretty well known as the multi-trip to the hardware store guy, because he often forgot or got the wrong items, which meant I had often been his tag-along for these trips. So naturally, I have to go to a different hardware store than he frequented. This meant I was now biking 3 miles to the edge of town to hopefully find someone to hear my plight and help me not be grounded for life. I finally reached my destination and found a clerk to match and mix the paint I required, a seafoam/pea green matte paint. As I was waiting, he asked why I looked so out of breath. I began to rehash the tale as he mixed and laughed at my misery. We made our way to the register and I paid for my wares. He gave me a few tips on making it dry quickly. I thanked him and I was on my way home, frantic because I knew my mom would be home soon as it was nearing time. I arrived and set to work like Mr. Wolf from Pulp Fiction. sanding and stripping away the paint on the door frame, painting in the harder spots first. After about 45 minutes, the coat of paint was down and the fans were blowing to dry everything up, and it looked as if nothing ever happened and I was saved. My mom came home as I had finished putting away the fans and stashing the paint in a far back cabinet where I knew it wouldn't be found. She never noticed, and the clever paint job was a success. My young life was saved by a 5-gallon can of paint and a hardware store clerk. It wasn't until 10 years and 2 moves later that I let my secret slip as I was past the statute of limitations on my attempted arson. She had quite a laugh as I told the story over Thanksgiving, and my grandparents also found this quite hilarious and have since made it a running joke. So there it is, how I messed up. Since someone wants to call BS, the amount of paint was the larger can you can get at stores. I am by no means an expert on paint can technology and probably grossly overjudged the size of said can. However, the fire did happen, the bike trip happened, the repaint happened, and all of this was through the panic of a 13-year-old. So forgive me if the size of a bucket seems a little off. So much for making strangers laugh at my life, LOL. Story 9. Not myself, but my dad had the story confirmed to me by him and a number of his friends who were there too, so it definitely was true. He was on a rugby tour with his team, and in classic rugby tour fashion, were being idiots in their hotel, drinking too much, being rowdy, that sort of stuff. At one point, it ended up with my dad chasing one of his teammates down the hallway. The teammate he was chasing was in the room right at the end of the hallway. They got up to a full sprint. The teammate got into his room before my dad could catch him and slammed the door behind himself. My dad was 6 foot 5 inches, about 195 centimeters, and weighed around 17 stone, so about 238 pounds in his playing days. So he was a big guy. He didn't have time to stop when his friend shut the door and ended up going straight through it. He took it straight off the hinges and cracked the wood in a number of places. They were due to leave the next day from the hotel, and due to a number of other breakages and the team generally just being pricks, the manager had said that if anything more was broken, they were to be thrown out and there were going to be full room inspections before they left either way. My dad was a bit of a handyman, so he carried a small set of screwdrivers with him wherever he went, and luckily he had them on this day. His teammates and him managed to screw the door hinges back onto the frame. The issue after this were the cracks in the door. The door was a dark brown color with the internal wood just being some light brown cheap chipboard-like material, so due to this, the cracks were very noticeable. One of his teammates came up with a plan. In each of their rooms, they had the standard complimentary tea, coffee, biscuits, as well as a small tub of Nutella to go with the biscuits. Nutella, conveniently, was almost a perfect color match to the broken door. A number of their rooms donated their Nutella to the cause, and they smeared the cracks with it to make them blend in. Along came the room inspection upon checkout, and the manager checked each room one by one with them watching. Apparently, they had left the door open for him in hopes that he would not use it at all. He didn't look at it at all on the way in and just shut it behind him on his way out. The door with makeshift chocolate-flavored cement held together, and he didn't notice a thing, and they had gotten away with it. As far as any of the guys involved know, the owner never got in contact with the club regarding the door over the following few weeks, so while he inevitably found out about it eventually, the running theory goes that due to him missing it in the inspection, they couldn't be blamed however many days or weeks later it was noticed. They'd have to be a pretty good friend for me to give up my own Nutella, to be honest. I hope you enjoyed the video and all the stories, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you're also going to enjoy what's the most messed up way to get revenge. Story 4 is pure evil. You gotta hear it. See you in that video, and thank you for watching this one.